Introduction in Chapter 1 of A Bunch of Everlastings, or Texts That Made History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Bauer. A Bunch of Everlastings, or Texts That Made History, by Frank Borum. By way of introduction, 25 years ago tonight, I was solemnly ordained a minister of the everlasting gospel. A medley of romantic circumstances conspired to fix indelibly upon my mind the profound impressions then created. I was a total stranger of this side of the planet. I had only landed in New Zealand a few hours before, yet here I was among a people who were pleased to recognize in me their first minister. Trembling under the consciousness of my boyish inexperience, and shuddering under the awful burden imposed upon me by the ordination charge, I felt that life had suddenly become tremendous. I was doing business in deep waters. As a recognition of the goodness and mercy that have followed me all the days of my ministerial life, I desire, with inexpressible thankfulness, to send forth this bunch of everlasting. Frank W. Borum, Armidale, Melbourne, Australia, March 15, 1920. End of introduction. Chapter 1. Thomas Chalmers text. It was a mystery. Nobody in Kilmeny could understand it. They were people of the flock and the field, men of the plow and the pasture. There were only about 150 families scattered across the parish, and such social life as they enjoyed all circled round the kirk. They were all very fond of their young minister, and very proud of his distinguished academic attainments. Already in his preaching, there were hints of that sublime thunder that afterward rolled through the world. In his later years, it was said of him that Scotland shuddered beneath his billowy eloquence as a cathedral vibrates to the deep notes of the organ. He became, as Lord Rosebery has testified, the most illustrious Scotsman since John Knox. But his farmer folk at Kilmeny could not be expected to foresee all this. They felt that their minister was no ordinary man, yet there was one thing about him that puzzled every member of the congregation. The drovers talked of it as they met each other on the long and lonely roads. The women discussed it as they waited outside the kirk, whilst their husbands harnessed the horses. The farmers themselves referred to it wonderingly when they talked things over in the stockyards and marketplace. Mr. Chalmers was only 23. He had matriculated at 12, had become a divinity student at 15, and at 19 had been licensed to preach. Now that, with much fear and trembling, he had settled at Kilmeny, he made a really excellent minister. He has himself told us that as he rode about his parish, his affections flew before him. He loved to get to the firesides of the people, and he won from old and young their unstinted admiration, their confidence, and their love. But for all that, the mystery remained. Briefly stated, it was this: why did he persist in preaching to these decent, well-meaning, and law-abiding Scottish farmers in a strain that implied that they ought to be in gaol? Why, Sabbath after Sabbath, did he thunder at them concerning the heinous wickedness of theft, of murder, and of adultery? After a hard week's work in the field and stable, briar and dairy, these sturdy Scotsmen drove to the kirk at the sound of the Sabbath bell, only to find themselves rated by the minister as though they had spent the week in open shame. They filed into their family pews with their wives and their sons and their daughters, and were straightway charged with all the crimes in the calendar. Later on, the minister himself saw both the absurdity and the pity of it. It was, as he told the good people of Kilmeny, part of his bitter self-reproach that for the greater part of the time he spent among them, I could expatiate only on the meanness of dishonesty, of the villainy of falsehood, on the despicable arts of calumny. In a word, upon all those deformities of character which awaken the natural indignation of the human heart against the pests and disturbers of human society. Now and again, the brilliant and eloquent young preacher turned aside from his line of things in order to denounce the designs of Napoleon. But as the Fifeshire farmers saw no way in which the arguments of their minister were likely to come under the notice of a tyrant and turn him from his fell purpose of invading Britain, they were as much perplexed by these sermons as by the others. This kind of thing continued without break from 1803 until 1811, and the parish stood bewildered. From 1803 until 1811? But what of the 4 years that followed? For he remained at Kilmeny until 1815, the year of Waterloo. Let me set a second picture beside the one I have already painted. Could any contrast be greater? The people were bewildered before. They were even more bewildered now. The minister was another man. The kirk was another place. During those closing years at Kilmeny, Mr. Chalmers thundered against the grosser crimes no more. He never again held forth from his pulpit against the iniquities of the Napoleonic program. But every Sunday he had something fresh to say about the love of God, about the cross of Christ, and about the way of salvation. Every Sunday he urged his people with tears to repent, to believe, and to enter into life everlasting. Every Sunday he set before them the beauty of the Christian life, and by all the arts and eloquent persuasion endeavored to lead his people into it. He would bend over the pulpit, writes one who heard him both before and after the change. He would bend over the pulpit and press us to take the gift, as if he had in that moment in his hand, and would not be satisfied till every one of us had got possession of it. And often, when the sermon was over and the psalms was sung, he rose to pronounce the blessing. He would break out afresh with some new entreaty, unwilling to let us go until he had made one more effort to persuade us to accept it. Now here are the two pictures side by side. The picture of Chalmers during his first 8 years at Kilmeny, and the picture of Chalmers during his last 4 years there. The question is, what happened in 1811 to bring about the change? That is the question, and the answer, bluntly stated, is that in 1811 Chalmers was converted. He made a startling discovery, the most sensational discovery that any man ever made. He had occupied all the years of his ministry on the 10 Commandments. Now he discovered not only that there are more commandments than 10, but the greatest commandment of all are not to be found among the 10. The experience of Chalmers resembles in many respects the experience of the Marquis of Lossy. Readers of George MacDonald's Malcolm will never forget the chapter on the Marquis and the schoolmaster. The dying Marquis